Good morning, and welcome to the first of what will be three videos on the digestive system and nutrition. Now, the digestive system itself tends to be one of the systems that most students either know the most about or at least think that they know the most about. All right. So here's the deal. All right. Your body needs to take in energy from the outside world, right? That's one of the keys to animal existence. But each of your cells is the functional unit of your body. And so the food itself needs to get into each of your cells. Now, you can't take what you eat for dinner and simply break it into teeny weeny little pieces and feed each cell. All right. That's not the way that this works. All right. You need to take your food, break it down into the chemical components uh, of that food, proteins and carbohydrates and fats and so on, and then distribute that stuff to each and every cell in your body. All right. Now, the digestive system itself is a tube within a tube. All right. In other words, it starts at your mouth, and hopefully you know where it ends. All right. You're probably sitting on it right now. All right. But the food that enters is travels all the way through. It's like a tunnel through your body, and in that tunnel is where the food is actually processed. You take out of it what you need, and the rest is then egested out or eliminated out. All right. So when you eat your food, it's the components of that food are digested or they're not. And then those digested particles are either absorbed into the body or they are not. All right. So, again, you need to break your food down into its molecular component. So, essentially, the goal of digestion is hydrolysis. All right. You want to break down organic compounds with water. So, think about this. What do you have with every meal, right? Something to drink, right? Why? Because what you drink is mostly water, and that the water in that drink of whatever sort you're consuming actually helps you to digest your food. Anything that can't be hydrolyzed, anything that can't be broken down, is eventually eliminated through the anus. And food itself moves through the from the mouth all the way down to the anus. Now, there are five major steps in the digestive process. The first is ingestion, and this is the one of the two that you have at least some control over, right? You are not ever force fed, right? Maybe as a baby, I suppose. But ingestion is the intake of food via the mouth. This is what you do. You control this part, eating. Okay, and whatever it is you happen to be eating, whether it's a pizza or scrambled eggs or whatever it happens to be, you control ingestion. The food also needs to be digested, meaning that it's either mechanically broken down into smaller pieces, that chewing and that sort of thing, or chemically broken down using hydrolysis to break the carbohydrates into simple sugars, to break the proteins into amino acids, and so on. Obviously, the food has to be moved throughout your body. Your digestive tract is many meters long. Your small intestine alone is 18 feet long. All right. And so the movement of food through your body takes place by a process called peristalsis. Peristalsis. All right. And this is the involuntary, you don't think about this, but it's the involuntary movement of food through your digestive tract. All right. And this, by the way, starts as soon as you swallow your food, right? So it starts in the esophagus and continues all the way to the colon, where essentially the leftovers, the waste products, are stored until you're ready to ingest them. Now, it's not simply enough to break the food down. You also have to get it to all of the cells. So you have to get those amino acids and the fatty acids and glycerols. You have to get them to all of your cells. And so they need to be absorbed into the body at some point. And so absorption is the movement of materials or nutrients across the GI tract wall to be delivered to the cells via the blood. Okay? Because remember, the blood is the transport system for all of these things. And then finally, when the leftovers, the waste products are accumulate in the colon, and eventually you poop. All right, and that is elimination, sometimes referred to as egestion. Okay, it is not, by the way, excretion. All right, people, I've heard students and other people say that they're, when they poop, they're excreting. That is not true. That's egestion. Excretion is the elimination of uh, other things, and we'll get to that in 2 more chapters. Okay, so what does the digestive system actually look like? All right, it looks like this. All right, obviously we start the whole process in the mouth, and there's a couple of, and we'll talk about each of these parts as we go through this series of videos. But in the mouth, you are breaking down your food mechanically using your teeth and your tongue. All right, you're moving stuff around, you're chewing it up, you're breaking it into smaller and smaller pieces. But at the same time, you have 3 pairs of salivary glands that you can see here, for the love of God, here and here and here. And these are secreting enzymes that help to start breaking down carbohydrates. The food then passes into the esophagus, and it runs right through your thoracic cavity into your abdominal cavity and enters the stomach, which is this organ right here. Here you secrete more enzymes and stomach acid, which helps to mechanically and chemically break down proteins specifically. And then eventually passes it into the small intestine, which is this big squiggly thing that you see in here. Now, before the food gets into the small intestine, 3 glands help to distribute other things: the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. And they're all located here. This is the liver. This tiny little green thing is the gallbladder. And the pancreas is this yellowish thing that you see behind the stomach. All right. Once the food enters the small intestine, we then digest the fats. All right, so we started digestion of the carbohydrates in the mouth, proteins in the stomach, and fat digestion begins in the small intestine. But we also continue to digest the proteins and the carbohydrates there as well. And that all takes place in the first portion of the small intestine. When we enter the second portion, the longer end of the small intestine, this is where absorption takes place. So all of the amino acids, the simple sugars, the fatty acids and glycerols, DNA molecules, they're all absorbed through the wall of the small intestine and into the bloodstream to be distributed to all of your cells. Finally, what's left over enters the large intestine, and this is mostly for the reabsorption of water. All right, so you reabsorb the water and keep that in your body. And then what's left over is your feces, all right, your poop. And eventually that is then eliminated through the anus. Okay, so I tried to find an image of a food that had proteins and carbohydrates and fats in it as well. And the one that popped immediately to my head was a Big Mac. All right. So if you've ever had a Big Mac attack, you know that a Big Mac contains carbohydrates in the buns and the secret sauce, special sauce, whatever they call it at McDonald's. I don't know. It contains proteins and some fats in the beef or whatever meat that happens to be. There's probably also a little bit of protein in the cheese, maybe if it's real cheese. I'm not sure if it's processed cheese food or just real cheese. And of course, there's roughage, stuff, indigestible material in the pickles and the lettuce and that sort of thing. And so over the course of the next few slides, we're going to talk about how all of those things get broken down. Obviously, the first step here is the mouth. All right, this is where food is ingested, and this is a weird little picture of the inside of your mouth. Now, in your mouth, there are three pairs of salivary glands, and they release an enzyme called salivary amylase. And salivary amylase begins carbohydrate digestion. All right, so this is where carbs are first digested. Interestingly enough, when you taste your food, most of what you're tasting is carbohydrates. Salt also plays a role in that kind of thing, but most of it is sugars. All right. What does chicken taste like? What does steak taste like? What does spare rib taste like? It tastes like whatever you cook it in. All right. Yes, there are some distinguishing characteristics between chicken and beef and that sort of thing, but for the most part, plain meat. If you just took a regular piece of meat and baked it or barbecued it or whatever, and didn't put any sauce on it, you wouldn't really taste much there. All right. The taste comes from the carbohydrates. Now, at the back of the mouth, there are your tonsils. All right. And here's a tonsil right here. And of course, these are part of the lymphatic system. And they help to pull out germs, bacteria, viruses, and other things that may be contained in your food or in the air that you're breathing. A lot of people think that this thing that hangs at the back of your throat is the tonsils, and that's not true. That's called the uvula, and that actually plays a role in producing sound, speaking. You have teeth here. You can see you have, as an adult, you have 32 different teeth. Um, as a child, you have 20 deciduous teeth. We'll get to that in a minute. But you've got four incisors on the top. Well, actually, we're going to start here and work our way down this side. All right. And just know that you've got four sets of these. So the first two teeth, these are the incisors. This is called the canine. You've got two premolars. And then finally, three molars. All right. And the last set of molars are called the wisdom teeth. And you may or may not have these. Either they didn't grow or they may have been removed. Your tongue, which is down here, is covered in taste buds. All right. And it also helps you to move your food around your mouth so that your teeth can get a good bite on it. And eventually, the tongue will move the chewed up food to the back of your throat so that you can swallow it. Okay, so back to our Big Mac. All right, what happens in the mouth? All right, well, obviously, we begin the mechanical digestion of food using the teeth and the tongue. But in the mouth, the chemical digestion of carbohydrates begins as well. And remember, we use salivary amylase. All right, and amylase is an enzyme that helps to break down sugars or carbohydrates. And we use salivary amylase to begin to digest carbohydrates. This is why we taste sugary things or sweet things more distinctly than we taste proteins and fats. All right. So where do we find carbohydrates in the Big Mac? Well, we find complex carbohydrates in the bread, the bun that we're consuming. Okay. Those complex carbohydrates will begin to be broken down. And then, of course, we find simple sugars, sweet things in the special sauce and wherever else. Okay. So let's talk about the tooth in and of itself. Now, this is a generalized picture of a tooth. It represents, probably best represents one of the molars or premolars, but the same general structure exists for all of the teeth. Your teeth are covered with a heavy material called enamel. All right, and that's the white stuff that you see up here. Underneath that is a living portion of the tooth called dentin, but the real living aspect of the tooth are found in right in the middle here. And notice that the inside of your tooth contains all sorts of blood vessels. So, arteries are bringing blood into the tooth, veins are bringing blood out of the tooth, and there are nerves in there as well. There are in most teeth, two root here. And the center of the root is called the root canal. When you have a root canal in your teeth, essentially what the dentist is doing is drilling down through the canal to destroy all of these nerves and blood vessels because the tooth has become inflamed or infected or damaged in some way, and they're trying to kill the nerve so that you don't experience pain anymore. Notice that the tooth is surrounded by what's called the periodontal membrane. That's this pink stuff in here, which, when it's exposed to the outside world, is referred to as your gum. All right. Down here, this area in here, this is your jawbone. All right. So your teeth are literally embedded right into your jaw. Okay. The next step, once the food is swallowed, it enters the pharynx and the esophagus. Now, the pharynx is simply a cavity between your mouth and your esophagus, all right? And it's basically just a passageway for food and for air in respiration, which we'll talk about in the next set of videos. Um, but there's no digestion going on in the pharynx, so don't no digestive processes occur here. All right, the food simply passes from the mouth to the esophagus through the pharynx, specifically what we call the oropharynx, which means the mouth portion of the pharynx. There's also a pharynx behind your nose and a little bit lower down behind your voice box, but food passes through the pharynx and into the esophagus. Now, once it's done that, the entire digestive process becomes automatic. All right. The esophagus carries food to the stomach by the process I talked about earlier, which was peristalsis, which is a rhythmic contraction of the esophagus. And what does that actually look like? Well, in this diagram, you can see this is the jawbone, upper and lower. This thing right here represents a tooth. But notice that your tongue pushes the food bolus, the chewed up food, up to the roof of your mouth, and it then makes its way back into this area, which is the oropharynx. Now, notice this little flap of connective tissue here called the epiglottis. Its job is to divert the food into the esophagus, which is back here. Okay. The tube up front is your windpipe or your trachea. All right, that's this. And the opening to that is called the glottis. Well, you don't want food going down into your lungs. And so what happens is, as the bolus passes through the oropharynx, it pushes on this flap of connective tissue and it bends it over. And you can see that in this diagram here, and it covers the glottis. All right. That means that the food will pass past the trachea and into the esophagus, which is where you want it. Okay, and this is why you can't talk and or breathe while you're swallowing food. All right, you can't push air out of the trachea while you're swallowing because the opening to the trachea is closed. Now, peristalsis occurs as soon as the food hits the esophagus. As a matter of fact, peristalsis is always occurring. But when there's food in the esophagus, the rhythmic contraction moves the food downward. And you can kind of see that in this diagram here. And it carries it all the way down to the stomach. Now, the esophagus itself is composed of two sets of muscles, one which is circular, and so it's decreasing the diameter and increasing, decreasing and increasing. And then there's a set that runs up and down that goes back and forth. And these two movements together make up the process of peristalsis. And that pushes the food down eventually into the stomach. All right. So remember, when your mom tells you not to talk with your mouth full, you really can't anyway. Okay. So I'm going to leave it there for this first of 3 videos on the digestive system and nutrition, and I hope you learned something.